HarperCollins presents The Templar Secret by Scott Mariani, read by Colin Mace. Prologue. Southern France, April 1308. The soldiers were still out there hunting for him, he knew it, and they wouldn't give up their search until he was their prisoner, covered in chains and hurled into a dungeon, awaiting the most tortuous execution it was possible for a man to suffer. The fugitive's name was Thibault. Twice that day he'd been convinced he could feel the pounding of hooves resonating through the cold stone floor on which he crouched down here in the darkness, and that he could hear the whinny of horses and men's muffled voices coming from outside. Or perhaps he was just imagining it, he tried to tell himself. Hunger could play strange tricks on the mind, and he hadn't eaten anything since his last near-disastrous venture out of the crypt to forage for food. He was losing count of the days, but it must have been a week ago at least. On that occasion, having crawled through the narrow escape passage that tunneled below the outer wall of the manor house, he'd wandered for nearly half a mile through the woods before he'd spotted the family of rabbits running over a grassy knoll. He'd used his slingshot to kill one of them, gutted and skinned it with his dagger, and he'd been in the process of gathering dry twigs to build a fire over which to roast his catch when the thunder of approaching horsemen had alerted him. Peering through the foliage, he'd watched the troop of soldiers gallop by. If they'd turned up just minutes later than they had, they would have smelled the smoke of his fire, and it was unlikely that one man on foot, even a knight, as skilled in warfare as he was, could have evaded 8 well-fed and determined king's men on horseback. More of them were sure to be scouring the countryside for him, and so, unwilling to risk staying out in the open, Thibault had crept back through the woods to his secret refuge and devoured the rabbit uncooked. Since that anxious day he hadn't dared to venture out again a single time, though he knew he couldn't stay forever. His meagre water supply was dwindling fast. How long had he been living down here now? 3 weeks? A month? He was losing track. His temporary abode was a small, dank stone crypt, secretly located below the floor of the rambling great manor house, though it was far from comfortable as a hideout. He was fortunate to have one at all. Many of his fellow knights had been far less lucky, rounded up, incarcerated and executed in the weeks and months following the joint royal and papal decree announced during the autumn of the previous year that had made outlaws of them literally overnight. And Thibault was deeply grateful to the sympathetic noble family who had allowed him to take refuge in the crypt of their country home. They were risking a great deal by offering protection to a member of a condemned military order, whose extermination had been sanctioned at the very highest level. For their own sakes, the family had travelled north to their residence near Paris for the season, taking all their staff and servants with them. That way, if Thibault was caught, they could deny all knowledge of his having been here. He couldn't blame them for being cautious in these dangerous times. As he'd slowly adapted to his new life as a hunted outlaw, Thibault had had plenty of time to reflect on the dramatic and utterly unforeseen turn of events that had reduced a hitherto powerful and respected order of knights to a scattered band of renegades, accused of the most terrible forms of heresy against God and the Church. The persecution had been as ruthless as it was sudden, and he had no doubt the authorities intended to continue it until every last one of them was dead. Never before in their long and successful history, through all the wars and conquests in which they'd so loyally defended Christendom against its foes, had they been threatened with such total extinction. That they should be facing that grim prospect now seemed unthinkable, yet it was true, and in his darker moments, of which there were many, Thibault feared that this was truly the end for his kind. It wasn't so much the fear of his own death that haunted him. God knew he'd faced that enough times in the past, nor even that of the pain and torture inflicted at the hands of his would-be executioners. What troubled him far more was that if he and all his fellow knights were to die, then so too would die their sacred legacy, the precious secret that every member of their order was sworn to uphold. The secret could not, must not, be allowed to pass into obscurity and be forgotten. And recently, over the course of these endless days and nights that Thibault had spent hiding in the darkness of the crypt like an animal in its burrow, he'd become increasingly convinced that he must do something to prevent that from happening. But what? And how?
Sample complete. Ready to continue?